Hi, everyone, for joining us virtually. I'm Anthony Ong. I'm the director of the Cornell Center for Integrative Developmental Science, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Dr. Christianne Hoppmann. Dr. Hoppmann is a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia, where she holds the prestigious Canada Research Chair in Health and Adult Development. She's also currently, we were just chatting about this earlier, Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies at UBC. Her research is both varied and wide and include social aspects of aging, stress, health promotion, social determinants of health, and individual differences in goals, all of which are aimed to understand health and well-being across the adult lifespan. And today she's going to be sharing some of her insights and thoughts on her work in the area of solitude across the lifespan. So I'm very excited and look forward to hearing her speak today. Before I turn it over to Dr. Hoppmann, I just want to remind those in attendance to please post your questions in the Zoom chat, and just feel free to post those questions as the talk is ongoing, so we can get started with those questions straight away, or try to put them as quickly as possible into the chat after the talk. So with that, Christianne, if you're ready, please share with us your slides and take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony, for the kind introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about, some more recent work that my students and I have been working on in my lab. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that UBC is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I'd also like to acknowledge that Cornell is located on the traditional homelands of the Cayuga Nation, and consistent with our values of community and inclusion, I think that we have a responsibility to honor and make visible those relationships with the indigenous people on whose lands we live and work. And so just as a kind of preface and acknowledgement. So we were just chatting a little bit. I'm used to talking about social relationships and health, and Anthony gave me an opportunity to take a deeper dive into a more recent stream of studies that my students and I have been working on that focus on solitude. So what is solitude? Solitude is often defined as an absence of social interaction or alone time. And I'd like, as I walk you through our studies, introduce a more recent definition that we think is more fitting, and that is time to oneself. And defined as such, solitude is a transient state. It is something that you spend some time in and that you move out of as well. And it is different from constructs that we are more familiar with in the literature, such as loneliness, which is the perceived lack of social contact, or social isolation on the other end, which is typically quantified by the number of social ties in a person's network. We know that solitude is common. And so what you see here is studies looking at the amount of time based on daily time budgets that different age groups are reporting. And if we look at solitude durations, or the percentage of time that different age groups spent in solitude relative to their waking hours, then we know that in old age, solitude often occupies a very significant amount of time, and this is community dwelling older adults. So it is a phenomenon that is potentially interesting. It is common. We know from the literature that solitude can have very many different faces. It can be experienced as difficult and go along with loneliness. Oh, there's a picture missing. Let me see what I can do here. No, it's gone. I had a second picture here. It can go along with loneliness, be characterized by rumination and negative feelings. But there is also literature to suggest that when we spend time by ourselves, that may serve actually growth promoting purposes and be an maybe a space to relax, to be creative, to work, to take a step out of a conflict and problem solve. So solitude doesn't necessarily have to have a negative connotation. It can come in different forms. And in addition to that, it's also, and I don't expect you to take in this whole slide, but I also want to point out that solitude may show up differently across different times in life. And it could serve unique purposes depending on where someone is situated. So, for example, a child playing with a jigsaw puzzle may be trying to find out about, different characteristics of this object, manipulating objects, and that may be an important part of the stage that they are in and that they do by themselves. And solitude may serve yet other functions when we move further on for midlife adults. Many of us may like to work and spend that time concentrated by ourselves. Whereas an older adult, we know that there is more time that's spent on self-care, reflection, things like spirituality even. So solitude may be complex, it may serve different functions, and it may be age-graded. So if we want to look at solitude as a phenomenon that may be of potential interest, it raises the question of how do we capture it? And one approach that I'd like to share using a number of different studies is daily life assessments. And that's seeking to capture this phenomenon as people engage in their daily life routines without changing the experience through by way of an experimental manipulation, for example. And I recognize it's a unique approach. I like it because it allows us to find out what distinguishes a good day from a bad day. It allows us to look at people's self-reported feelings, the thoughts that they've been thinking about, their behaviors, and potentially even biomarkers like stress hormones. So what I'd like to do today is use the opportunity to take you on a little bit of a tour of a series of repeated daily life assessment studies where my students and I have been trying to understand some relevant antecedents, correlates, and consequences of solitude across different samples and age groups. And I'd like to begin by sharing with you some research that my former student, Jen Lay, who's now an assistant professor at Exeter University, has been working on seeking to better understand, kind of from an exploratory bottom-up perspective, if it might be possible to identify clustered experiences that occur when people are by themselves, that are characterized by certain types of signatures of thoughts and affect patterns, and to, as a second step, then try to understand if there are any individual level characteristics that would help us predict the propensity for someone to experience those clustered solitude experiences. And so the question really here was to identify affective states and thought patterns that characterize potentially positive as well as negatively clustered solitude experiences, and then as a step two, to seek to predict them. And how did we do that? Jen recruited a sample of community dwelling, middle-aged and older, and then also a second sample of university students. We sought to cast, we tried to cast a broad net, wanted to be inclusive, and translated all measures into Cantonese and Mandarin, given the local demographics here in Vancouver. And what the design was, and it's similar to the subsequent studies that you'll see, is we had a comprehensive baseline assessment before people then embarked on a 10-day daily life assessment study, asking them in the moment how you're feeling, what are you thinking about, what are your experiences right now, followed by another set of individual difference measures. And although I won't talk about that, we sometimes also have longitudinal follow-ups. So how do we operationalize solitude in such assessments? So for the purpose of this study, we asked about the current social context, whether people were interacting with other people before the beep, whether others were nearby or whether they were alone. And if somebody indicated that they were not socially interacting, but somebody was around them, that's a kind of coffee shop experience. Or if they were by themselves, then that was considered a solitude episode for the purpose of the study. And we can talk about if this is the best or way of operationalizing. It's one way. And then what she did is she basically tried to identify clusters in those affect and thought reports. And then as a step 2, she sought to predict the propensity of those clustered experiences. And what she found through this approach is really 2 distinct clusters. One that was characterized by high arousal and low arousal positive affect, and thought patterns such as, watching my thoughts go by, mind wandering, those sorts of things. And the second cluster that was characterized by high and low arousal negative affect and reflective ruminative types of thinking. And she then went ahead and tried to predict those clustered experiences, and people high in social self-efficacy, for example, or people who had a high average desire for solitude were more likely to experience those positive clusters, and people scoring high on self-reflection were more likely to experience those negative solitude clusters in this particular sample. So if people have an overall high desire to experience solitude, that then, of course, raises the question of whether solitude is sought out or voluntary in nature, or whether it just happens due to external circumstances. And that is something that we addressed in the next step. And so I'd like to share another study using part of that same data set to address the important question of if and what we know about solitude seeking as a potential predictor of how it is experienced, and potential age differences in how solitude is experienced emotionally. And the prediction underlying the study was that older adults would seek to optimize their emotional experiences, and that solitude might serve important developmental functions in that particular age group that would make solitude, if sought out, more pleasant. And so this is this is Jen. I want to make sure she is recognized for the important work that she has done in my lab, and that we collaborate on, continue to collaborate on. And so the question guiding that study was, do older adults show more favorable solitude-seeking affect associations than middle-aged adults? And also we wanted to know where older adults, as compared to middle-aged adults, would be when in solitude. And given potential high degrees of freedom in the older adult age group, we suspected that they would be more likely to be at home or outdoors during those instances. And I won't spend much time on here. This is the first study that we did, specifically focusing on solitude, and it is focusing on the older adult portion of the study that I've already introduced, asking those additional follow-up questions. And so it's based on the same solitude assessment, but it also takes into consideration a second part of that question, and that is, where would you like to be ideally in this current situation? Would you like to be interacting with other people? Would you like to be by yourself but have others nearby? Or would you like to be alone? And what I find interesting at a more descriptive level is that, first of all, solitude is very common. Of the instances that we captured using those daily life assessments, 63% were solitude occasions. And of those solitude occasions in this context, 2013 time snippets, the vast majority was desired. People indicated, this is my current social context, and that's exactly how I want it to be. Which I think is interesting in and of itself. Jen then moved on to ask, where are people located when they experience solitude? And older adults were more likely to be at home as compared to a range of other places when reporting voluntary solitude. Oh, there was a problem with my slides. Let me try to bring them up again. My apologies. It just crashed.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I clicked any button, but I don't think I did. Like, cause yours to go away.
Okay. I will just bear with me for a second as I bring it back up, and I will. Can you see my slides? Okay, great. So older adults were more likely to be at home as compared to other places, and older adults were also more likely to be outside as compared to other places. But beyond that, and potentially more interesting, we also saw that middle-aged adults experienced, more elevated negative affect during solitude. And this line, which represents the older adults, is pretty flat. So older adults did not see, for older adults, we did not see that time varying association between negative affect and solitude experiences. So to kind of wrap up, most solitude experiences in this middle-aged and older sample were actually sought out, and we did see that older adults are more likely to spend solitude at home or outside, and that middle-aged adults, other than older adults, do appear to have less positive emotional experiences during solitude seeking. And because as someone who has spent the first decade of her career studying social relationships in health, the next question we then asked was, well, okay, so there must be some resources that help people do well during solitude, and might some of those resources be related to their social relationships? The idea being, and a lot of this work, has been done by people at Cornell, actually, so I want to make sure that's dutifully acknowledged. And so the question became is, who has the capacity to spend time in solitude and maximize the adaptive potential of what might happen during those instances? And the prediction was, and this is work by Teresa Pauly, who's now a Canada Research Chair herself at SFU, it led to the question of, might it be that high quality social relationships create those kinds of circumstances where someone feels that they have choice, and that it shapes solitude experiences in such a way that they aren't perceived as threatening, but that they in fact can be experienced positively. And so I'd like to introduce another study that's using coordinated analyses across two data sets. One where the late Freda Blanchard-Fields was a PI on in Atlanta, Georgia. Also a reasonably diverse sample, as well as the study that I just introduced as part of Jennifer Lay's project. And what Teresa then tried to look at is, if people reporting positive relationships with other people, if that individual level characteristic might buffer, or if there would be an interaction rendering the association between time alone and negative affect differently. And she was able to provide evidence for the same effect across two data sets, basically indicating, so what you would see here is the dotted lines, people with high quality social relationships, and the straight line, people reporting lower positive relationships with other people, that when people with high quality social relationships experienced solitude, it did not lead to an increase in negative affect in the same way it did for people with low quality social relationships. And so that indicates to me that the importance of social resources, high quality social relationships, if we want, and the maintenance of such up into old age, if we want to understand how people might be able to tap into some of the positive contours of solitude experiences. So we were ready to ask all those fantastic new questions. And then something significant happened that actually shaped this very phenomenon that we were seeking to study. And that was the COVID pandemic, which created circumstances that put a totally different light onto what it means to spend time alone. And of course, we're all familiar with the rise in loneliness experiences, but I want to point out that solitude, even during the pandemic, might have been a very heterogeneous experience, because people were, our provincial health officer said, well, we are all in the same storm, but we sit in different boats. And so a social context mattered for this type of experience. And some people actually had too little time to themselves and were challenged to think about, well, but if I want to do those things and I need time for myself, how do I make that happen during those new circumstances? And so that led to another study. Oh my gosh. I seriously hope that I don't need to restart my computer.
Wow.
I did not touch a thing, but move on.
Seems like you're able to get a good 10 to 15 minutes in per run, so that's good.
There are a couple more studies that I'd like to share with you.
We can easily edit out these as well, these interludes.
That would be terrific. Can you see? Okay, good. And so one question that we thought might be interesting is to understand the type of resources that would, beyond positive social relationships, that would render solitude, it would shed a more positive light on those solitude experiences. And this was spearheaded by my student Yeon-Suk Choi. And I'd like to share two snippets of a study that looked at, we tried to replicate how is solitude associated with varying affect experiences during the pandemic, but also looking at potential moderators beyond social relationships that might buffer the experiences. And here we chose a burst design. What I'll focus on, we had annual bursts once we figured out that this pandemic wasn't going to be over in 3 months, as we had hoped initially. But I'll focus on the first burst. Here we recruited a sample of about 150 individuals who, through Qualtrics online due to the pandemic, answered daily life questionnaires about their affect experiences, provided some insights into demographics and so forth. And here we looked at a different way of operationalizing solitude, which has emerged from our thinking, and that is, could we reasonably think of solitude as time to oneself? Because there's a challenge to counting everything that's not a social interaction as equally relevant to this experience. So we try to take a different spin on that, and then also ask different questions about resources that we thought were very relevant in this context. And what I'd like to point out is something that may not be surprising in light of the fact that solitude was potentially experienced so differently by different people depending their life circumstances during the pandemic. And we virtually did not see any day-to-day variation in the association between solitude duration and daily affect. But if we then tap into that significant variability, we were able to show that daily optimism, daily curiosity, and creativity experiences were positively associated with a link between solitude and positive affect here, as well as the link between a negative affect and solitude. So what we take this to mean is that clearly the pandemic created different and new circumstances on what it means to spend time by oneself, and that people who generally reported higher optimism, creativity, and curiosity, but also days that were characterized by elevated optimistic feelings, creativity, and curiosity, were characterized by solitude that was experienced more positively. And And based on those experiences, we then were still curious to link this back to the social relationship literature and seek to better understand if the pandemic and with literature coming out pointing to the fact that particularly in households with kids who couldn't go to school for months in a row, some of those households were turned into pressure cookers. We were curious to see what role structural as well as qualitative aspects of social relationships might play for how solitude is experienced during those times where we all spend so much more time in our own core households. And this is again research that Jan Suk deserves credit for. And the questions that we were asking here is if we might be able to see something similar to the pre-pandemic studies in that people who generally report positive relationships with other people would experience solitude more positively. And we also were curious to see the role of conflict that may flare up in those households, thinking that it would negatively shape solitude experiences. And it's again based on that same study in the first burst, so I will not spend much time on it. We were a little bit surprised that structural aspects of households, the number of people someone lived with, did not moderate solitude affect links. Overall, though, people living by themselves reported lower positive affect and higher negative affect during the pandemic. What we did see, though, was a moderation of the more qualitative aspects of social relationships. And I know this is a busy table, so I'll walk you through it. So in essence, what we see here is that for people, when we look at positive relationships as a potential moderator of positive affect and negative affect, we do see the same interaction that has been reported prior to the pandemic, in that when people reporting positive relationships with other people experience solitude, they take less of a dip in positive affect, and they also report less negative affect. What we also found is this, and that was not exactly what we had expected, but it has been reported before. So we see a non-surprising negative association between reporting high conflict in one's relationships with positive affect overall and negative affect overall. But we also see a positive interaction, which suggests that also for people in conflictual relationship, was it good to take a break and spend some time in solitude? And this has been reported before by Kira Burdett and using a US study pre-pandemic, actually. So there may be very different things going on that may be important to disentangle moving forward. And then the last study I wanted to share with you is then trying to take that explicitly back, those findings back into a social life context by not only studying individuals' perceptions of the quality of their social ties, but actually looking at how partners balance the need for autonomy, wanting of solitude, and experiences of social connectedness. And what we did here is we recruited diet, where older adults could participate with a close other. The close other was not restricted to married partners. We wanted to know who shows up and cast a little bit of a broader net in recognition of the fact that the experience of older adults doesn't always lend itself for participating with a spouse due to circumstances or due to various characteristics of those relationships. And this is work that Ellie Zambrano deserves credit for, and that's currently under review. And what we wanted to do as a kind of first step is see if not only we might see the associations between voluntary solitude and daily affect quality that I've shared with you before, that may actually, under some circumstances, be positive, but if we might also see matching partner effects, so that if one is living with a partner who is reporting a voluntary solitude, that might also be positively reflected in one's own affect quality. And then we added a second component, and we tried to specifically ask, well, if you told us that you spent this and that amount of solitude by today, was that something that you were looking for, or something that bothered you? And so we had the opportunity of looking at individual level associations between solitude that was not sought out and explicitly characterized as unwanted, and the associations with current emotional experiences within individuals and across partners within a diet. And in order to do that, we recruited a sample of 136 older adults who invited a close other of their choice to participate in this study. Very similar setup, a baseline assessment of background characteristics and 10 days of daily life assessments. And I just want to give you a quick glance and some of those findings. When it comes to positive affect, we did find both individual and partner effects. In other words, if people sought out solitude, let me look at this again. So no, I have to correct myself. So this is voluntary solitude, and both positive affect as well as negative affect as it occurs. And what we find here is that daily voluntary solitude was associated with positive affect, and that we did find individual, and those are the straight lines, as well as partner effects on this association. There was no link with negative affect. Keep in mind, during the pandemic. And when we look at bothersome solitude, we find individual or actor as well as partner effect for both in the expected direction for positive affect as well as negative affect in this sample of older adults with a close other. So to me, that's a very clear indication that the context matters. Perceptions of social relationships, as well as how people navigate those social dynamics as they engage in their daily life routines. And this may be a very Canadian example of an older adult sitting at a mountaintop reflecting, but it would seem to matter if they are sitting there by themselves, or if more than one person independently sits at that mountaintop and enjoys the experience for themselves, but potentially in the company of other people. And in addition to this kind of, micro context, micro social context, we're also exploring, and this is work that's that I'm collaborating on together with Helene Fung in Hong Kong, is to what extent the social cultural context may render those experiences differently, because solitude is valued differently in Eastern and Western social contexts. I also think that it's important to recognize that solitude, the meaning of solitude and the experience of solitude could differ across different life phases, and that it may be uniquely shaped by historical circumstances. And I think the verdict's out about the extent to which we're going to see period or cohort effects coming out of this pandemic experiences that will stay with us for some time and that are deeply shaped by what people did and how they experienced this extended time alone or together with other people. And finally, I think, and this is something that I'm hoping to spend a little bit more time on, I think it's also important to recognize the role of time in solitude experiences. I think it's very intuitive to most people that solitude would be experienced differently if it occurs for an hour or two and we seek it out. But, where's the line? How long can solitude be for us to still treasure it? And, when does it cut a certain threshold where it might turn into something that's qualitatively different, such as social isolation? I think it's also important to take into consideration that there could be time-lagged effects that are worth finding out. So it's possible that someone takes themselves out of the action zone when they are encountering an interpersonal problem to think through what they can and ought to do about it, and that is experienced negatively. However, it may facilitate re-engagement into a social situation with that same person. And then finally, as developmental psychologists, it's also important to recognize that the capacity to spend time alone would differ depending on where someone's located along the chronological age spectrum. A child spending 15 minutes by themselves on a puzzle, that would be a long time. If the parent of that very child tries to get some uninterrupted work done, 15 minutes seems very little. And so there is this age component to that experience as well. So that's what I had prepared so far. I want to acknowledge the funders that made that work possible, collaborators and former students who've played an absolutely key role in this. Our participants who generously shared their thoughts, and my lab at UBC, which without whom none of that would be possible either. So I'm going to close here, and I hope we are still good on time to address potential questions.
Great. Thank you, Christianne. Yes, we have plenty of time. And if you want to stop the screen share so that you can see everyone, great.
Sure.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for that really stimulating presentation. And so we have time for questions, and I may take this opportunity as moderator and maybe ask some questions if you don't mind.
Sure.
So I'm really intrigued by your thoughts on this distinction between solitude and social isolation. And so
Right.
in some of your early studies, you defined it in terms of both being alone, but also being with others, but not interacting necessarily with others.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very interesting. And in subsequent studies, it seemed like you brought in motivation. Like, are you choosing to be with? Are you choosing to be alone, or are you not? And I thought that part was really helpful in terms of maybe trying to understand how solitude may be different from social isolation, or how social isolation may be just, a broad umbrella term that may include solitude. So I guess I'm wondering, how first of all, are there measures of solitude that you would point to that kind of help us kind of get a better understanding of how, as a construct, it may differ from social isolation? Is it motivation? Is it this timing aspect that you pointed out earlier? So in lots of these measures of social isolation, it's about frequency of contact, but it's typically over, like, say, a 2-week period.
I know. Mm-hmm.
So, how do you think of solitude? I mean, I guess you were alluding to this, that maybe over an extended period of time, solitude may not be as beneficial. I don't know, these are all just sort of questions that kind of bubble up as you're talking. How do you think of the difference between social isolation and solitude?
Yeah. I think the verdict is out, right? And it may depend on who it is that we are talking about in their life circumstances. But you raise an even more fundamental question, and that is, what is the active ingredient of solitude, right? How can we define, what is the essence of this phenomenon? And I'm afraid that empirically speaking, I don't think we have an answer yet. We can speak to some contours, some correlates, as you point out, and others are doing very important work in that context as well. But I don't think we know, and it's unfortunate but understandable that early definitions of solitude, kind of took the approach of defining it as time alone or an absence of social interaction. When you look at what an absence of social interaction can entail, it can be anything from me trying to call my wireless provider and spending 45 minutes on the phone, as well as me trying to get a review done. And those would be such different, qualitatively distinct experiences that would all be captured through an absence of social interaction. And so that's why we try to kind of rethink that and say, okay, so maybe if we want to look at that from a developmental perspective, solitude serving important functions, maybe we are better served by thinking of solitude as time to oneself. And so it's something that we are playing with. I'm not saying it's the best way to think about this, but it adds a little bit of precision, I would say, and it is also a question that one could reasonably ask of different age groups, right? So because there are complex solitude inventories that sometimes tap into experiences that are very age-bound, and that then make it difficult to, look at unique characteristics that may shape the experience of children, adolescents, young adults, middle-aged adults, and old adults. And from that perspective, it would also seem to matter then where on the lifespan you are in terms of how much time you're willing to, you can comfortably spend by yourself without feeling isolated. And I'll use one example, and this goes back to work by Margaret Baltus, who did yesterday interviews with older adults in Berlin. And what she found out is that the ability to spend time by yourself for someone who is 85 and living in the community, to them indicates that they can still do it. It provides them with a sense of autonomy. And that, so in a way, the meaning of this could very much shape how it's ultimately linked with well-being indicators. And I think we're just at a very, very early place in that. Another area that's currently being examined in this context quite actively, prior to the pandemic, but also during the pandemic, is what does it even mean to be socially interacting or not? Considering that we could be following or interacting with other people on the spectrum, right? So we could be, we could spend time on our cell phone, following others on Facebook. we could be chatting with other people. We could be, video conferencing with other people and still be in the same room by ourselves. And if we are having trouble defining what a social interaction is, how much more difficult does it then become to understand what true solitude might be? So sorry that I don't have an easy answer for you. I think you just, tap into some really fundamental questions. And I'll say one last thing, and that is, from a historical perspective, with people, leading faster lives, moving into bigger cities, there are actually also historians who have looked at over the past century what it means to spend time in solitude, the link to spirituality, the link to the environment, how much time people spend outside, that may also be relevant to this particular phenomenon that we are studying.
Yeah, no, thank you. I actually, I think your point about motivation is really helpful, because I do think that helps kind of tether apart solitude, or can at least solitude, from social isolation, and that it's really, in a sense, your desire to be alone. That's really not being picked up in these measures of social isolation, where, as you know, people are being grouped in terms of their frequency of social contact, and there's no information about whether or not they're choosing, to be alone or not. So I think that your point there about motivation is really helpful. I want to turn to the chat, if I may, and I know that there was a follow-up question that I wanted to get to. I think that is from Aisha. So Aisha, I don't see your question, but feel free to, if you to put it in the chat, or if you want to unmic yourself and ask, please do so.
Hi. Thank you so much. I kind of asked my question as well. How does loneliness play into this? Because I just wonder if we're just using like synonyms for the same thing when we're talking about social isolation and loneliness. And then I guess, I had another question. Can you grow your capacity for dealing with solitude? I also came in late, so I'm so sorry if I missed this and you already answered it.
Yeah, no, happy to speak to that. And loneliness is a related, but I think distinct construct. I think, there's empirical evidence that solitude can be experienced as lonely. However, solitude itself does not have a valence attached to it necessarily. It is described as time by yourself in an absence of social interaction, alone time, whereas loneliness at its very core is defined by the subjective experience of wanting to engage with other people and not being able to. So, from a definitional and operational perspective, they are distinct. And social isolation, is a more structural component, quantifying it, often quantified by the number of ties and the frequency of social interaction. And a valid question and that's potentially how it's related to what Anthony was asking, then becomes, is social isolation, potentially the same as chronic solitude? And I don't think we know. Is that what you were looking for?
Yes. And then the second question was if you can grow your capacity for solitude and choosing to, I guess, gain energy from being alone, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And there are different components to that, right? So there's actually a significant amount of early child literature on solitude, because a lot of the skills that our kids learn at school actually have to be practiced by themselves, right? So you learn math in the classroom, but then you also have to solve math problems by yourself, and you actually have to demonstrate being able to do that. And so, but our capacity to spend time doing that changes, and there are probably cognitive resources and important developmental phenomena underlying this from childhood to older adulthood. Another question that you may be more interested in, if we were only to focus on the adult lifespan, might be what are some of the resources that make us feel comfortable spending time alone so that we can react the positive kind of experiences that, did we just lose her? No, you're there, of solitude. And if I had to make an educated guess, it would probably, one aspect might be this feeling at home in social relationships, the safe haven idea that it's happening by choice, but you don't have to feel threatened by it. And I do think, and this gets back to what Anthony was asking, that it may be worthwhile distinguishing those solitude experiences when someone else is in the room and you're reading a book, or when someone else is in a different room but within the same space and you're working and they are working, but you could reconnect if you so chose. The other piece might be is, if you if this is serving an important purpose, like, you being creative, you accomplishing your goals, whether it's in a work setting or otherwise. Yeah.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you so much. There is a question about, in the chat, there's a question about gender differences. I think in one of your studies, you reported some gender differences in solitude, and the question is, could you speak more to that?
Yeah, I'm very happy to do that. And that gets back to, how I started to get interested in solitude. I think I pointed out at the beginning that I'm actually mainly doing research on social relationships and health. And as part of a collaboration on a team grant regarding men's health in older adulthood, we started to ask, we were curious why older men show up less in social and community settings, social exercise classes, and so forth. And so we started asking questions of, the motivation was, what does this programming need to look like for older adults, or men who self-identify as men, to want to do that? So that was our primary intention. However, in trying to figure that out, we asked the same question as, what are you currently doing? What's your current context? Would you rather be doing something else? And I was completely, at the time, shocked to see that older men predominantly reported exercising by themselves, and that is exactly how they wanted it. There was no appetite to change that. And so all of a sudden we had an empirical phenomenon in front of us that was a little bit puzzling, and that was very gendered. And that got us more interested into questions of preferences for solitude, and the unique experiences of men and women. And yes, there are a lot of studies out there demonstrating that men have a higher preference for solitude than do women.
Thank you. I think there was a virtual hand up from our friend Eileen Graham. Eileen, do you want to ask a question?
It was me. I didn't leave my hand up because it felt awkward to stand there with the virtual hand. No, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this really, really interesting talk. And it brought to mind, I was trying to frame what I had to say as a question, but it's really not a question. It's more just like enthusiastic comments about this concept that Anthony and I have started exploring over the last year or so, that we're calling social asymmetry. And it's this idea of people being isolated, but not experiencing that subjective experience of loneliness where you might expect them to, and vice versa. Somebody being with a lot of social contact, but feeling lonely anyways, like the alone in a crowded room phenomenon. And I think that this idea of solitude being isolation by choice, isolation over like maybe a constrained period of time. I loved the concept that you brought in about like how the time factor can really play in. But I feel like there's a lot of puzzle pieces here that really fit together nicely, and how the idea of solitude could be kind of what we're conceptualizing as social asymmetry on the more resilient side. Like, I am isolated by choice. I am choosing to be in this less social contact, and I'm not feeling lonely. And how that might play out in different developmental periods, I just think is really interesting. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd love to hear more as you're kind of moving forward on this idea of asymmetry in those social experiences. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Would love to have more conversations.
Great. Yeah, maybe we can continue that off online, or off online. So James, I see you have a question. Do you want to just ask your question?
Sure. I similar level of enthusiasm about this really fascinating work. The whole interaction between the quality of your social time affecting the potential mental health and related effects of your alone time is really, I think it's just really insightful. I guess I'm curious about, I've a lot of questions about this as a parent also, but I'm thinking about your work on the older adults and adaptive and less adaptive ways of adjusting to the predominance of alone time. And so, like, what do you expect an older adult to be more likely to say, oh, I like being alone, as a sort of adaptation to that state of their reality. And so I'm just curious if you have thoughts about that and what you might do to tackle that, or if it's not a phenomenon at all.
Yeah, we did think about, I did think about that quite a bit. And of course, when your lived reality is such that the majority of your time is spent by yourself, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, then you start justifying this as, you'd constantly feel bad if you'd say, oh, I so wish, my circumstances were different. You start saying that, well, I do spend a lot of time by myself, but I'm doing those kinds of things. And that's okay. It's okay. Actually, that's by choice. I don't have an answer, but I will say that if anybody ever tried to recruit lonely people into a group intervention, which is something that some of our community partners have sought to do, they were completely unsuccessful, because it is very self-relevant to kind of not only admit to yourself, but also to someone else that you're isolated, you do feel lonely, and you are seeking the social programming opportunity, because there's a possibility that it makes you feel deficient. And so that could be one nuance to that experience, but I do think that there are potentially additional factors to consider that are worth exploring.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really helpful answer. I'm thinking about some things you said that, like, older adults are more likely to optimize their emotional experience. I know some of the work Corinna's done suggests that it's not intuitive how older adults adapt to things like anticipated suffering or pain. And so I just think it's really fascinating work. Thanks again. Yeah,
no, my pleasure.
Thank you. So speaking of Corinna, I think, Corinna, you have a question. Do you want to ask your question?
I think you already in part spoke to this. I'm wondering about public policy implications. And Japan and Great Britain both have famously appointed ministers of loneliness to address concerns about both loneliness and social isolation. And so I'm wondering to what extent your work kind of brings a nuance to this. You already talked about, you cannot recruit lonely people for social engagement because that could be potentially stigmatizing and labeling. But are there broader societal implications?
Yeah. I'm always a little shy when I get that question based on a very limited body of research that I feel we can tap into right now. What I do think that it's often useful to be nuanced. I think there's rock solid evidence that social relationship and social engagement is absolutely key for health and well-being. And so the idea that you'd appoint someone politically to support people at risk of not having those meaningful social interactions, to look after them, makes a lot of sense to me. However, there's a little bit of a risk that there could be some polarizing going on in terms of talking about the loneliness epidemic and talking about an avalanche of experiences and the stigma that goes along with it. And to be honest with you, part of the reason why the solitude idea is so appealing to me is I'm an introvert. I actually like spending time by myself. I feel I often use it in a productive way, and that's quite age appropriate. And I certainly was one of the parents who had 2 elementary school kids at home that wondered, how on earth am I going to carve out more than 15 minutes of consecutive time to do some of the things that were reasonably expected I do? So I think, I don't want to make any broad claims. I think it's important to recognize that loneliness, has very negative and documented implications for health. I think people should continue investing in that important area. However, this dichotomy or labeling people may need to be rethought.
Thank you. Yeah, I sort of had a related question about interventions. We had Andrew Steptoe on last week, and I asked him this question about interventions for social isolation and loneliness, and he seemed to think that it's perhaps easier to intervene on social isolation than loneliness. Not clear how you necessarily would intervene on that. And I guess I'm just wondering, this is, I guess, a question for us working parents who, want more time to ourselves. What's the intervention that will help us experience more positive solitude?
Yeah. I mean, it's always easier to set up a system whereby, an intervention that's happening locally right now is Hey Neighbor. It's called Hey Neighbor, right? So people being encouraged to check in on their neighbors, people calling individuals who identify as valuing that. But those, as you point out, get at the kind of frequency of contact piece and what's happening qualitatively, and whether that needs to, what it would take in order for that to build thriving relationships. There could be a very, very large step in that. And also there is that literature that Eileen was alluding to, and that is you can feel lonely in a crowd, and that may occur in people who look like they are well connected, right? So you can feel very much out of place at a work party, based on who you are and how you identify as. And so tackling loneliness from that perspective does indeed feel less trivial, because it does have this subjective component to it. That's just a core part of the definition of what loneliness is. Yeah. I do think that we should give, it should be okay, socially speaking, to say I do need time for myself, and that's what some of our participants are actually saying, that they appreciate that. Us asking the question almost gives them permission to say, you know what, I love you very much, but I need to get this done.
Sure. Let's see here. I don't want to make sure I get all the questions in the chat. There's a question here about how early childhood experiences might shape the experience of solitude in adulthood. And the questioner is asking about whether being an only child versus growing up with siblings plays any role in that, or if you can speak more generally about the role of early childhood experiences and how that shapes adult experiences of solitude.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, but I'd be an idiot if I didn't disclose that at my core, my expertise is in aging. I do find it interesting, and I did look into that a little bit as we were putting together a special issue on solitude and IJBD. Structural aspects, and I'll call that a structural feature of how one might be growing up, do play a role in how people experience time alone and time with others, right? And so, of course, that would be a unique experience that shapes the interpretation of what it means to be by yourself. It probably also shapes your choice on how much of it you have to yourself. We know, for example, that during the pandemic, when a lot of people spent time in their nuclear families, only children were in a succinctly different position from children who had other siblings, right? How that's going to play out, I don't know. I don't know. It's reasonable to assume that it will shape subsequent experiences.
Great, thank you. So I see here, Tess, I don't know if this is a question or a comment for Christianne. Do you want to ask your question or state your comment?
It's really kind of just more of like another musing, I guess, of like kind of in vein with same vein as what James was saying, maybe just like reasoning your way through not finding alone time aversive, kind of like, is it just practice? Could it also be too, like not necessarily tied directly to chronological age, or with just like experiences of spending time alone? Does that make time alone less aversive?
So you were breaking up, Tess. I don't know if everyone had the same experience or if it was just me. Did everyone hear?
It was breaking up a little bit, yeah. But Tess, were you asking like, is it more about the experience? Are you saying like maybe it's not so much that older adults might adapt or like change the way they would label, but that they just have more experience with being alone, or like that might be the thing that is driving older adults being more positively affected by solitude. If is that?
Yes, yeah, sort of. Yeah, I guess like how do we disentangle chronological age with just experience of alone time?
It's difficult to say. One could reasonably think that there are multiple factors that shape solitude experiences in older adults. One would be, well, they just spend a lot of time in it. But one could also say, well, if solitude is experienced more positively in older adults, maybe that's also because they're able to tap into emotion regulation skills, making it less threatening. It also might reflect that older adults might have more degrees of freedom, more choice in terms of how they choose, how they'd like to spend their time. So to use an example, and I think that's also a little bit, how I make sense of this conflict interaction, is that, if you have a range of people you could be interacting with, you probably, if you're an older adult, anyone would gear towards the ones that are experienced as meaningful. And so but sometimes it may be preferable and better for your well-being to not engage in people who have given you trouble over and over again. And when you're an older adult, you might be able to navigate away from that. However, if I have a job and I don't like an office mate, tough luck. I'm seeing them anyways, right? And so I think there could be a number of different things that come into that. In addition to that, it's also, you know, the mere amount of time that's required to rest. It could be related to choices, qualitatively distinct choices, and on how one might approach problems. And so this is tapping into really Freda Blanchett-Field's work in demonstrating that taking yourself out of a conflict, thinking about what to do about it, and then being ready to re-engage, you know, might be a more typical pattern that one could observe in an older adult as compared to a young adult who would go straight on. and so it might be reflective of a number of different things.
Great, thank you. And I want to be mindful of time. And so I want to thank Dr. Hoppmann for coming online and sharing her insights today on her work. It's really fascinating work. And thank you for joining us. And thank everyone for taking time out. And I hope you all have some more solitude if you choose today, and spend more time alone happily. Thank you again, Christianne, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. And sorry for the tech hiccups. And I'd be delighted if you had an interest in kind of engaging on this conversation,
yeah.
In this construct of, you know, social isolation and some asymmetric experiences in that regard. So
Great.
It's a
yeah.
real pleasure to also find out about what you're currently thinking.
Great. Thanks, Christianne.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.